1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood wakes to a morning that tastes of coal smoke and broken glass, the kind of air that makes you swallow before you speak. In less than a day, a black business district will be marched at gunpoint, homes looted and set alight, and the numbers of the dead argued into a blur, polite enough to print. This is the calamity the city tried to rename until it sounded livable. What follows is drawn from a macabre photo album that outlived the Flames postcards and contact prints once traded like souvenirs, now an unblinking witness. People called it a banned memory, a truth effectively classified by shame and paperwork. But the images persist, insisting on streets, ledgers, and faces that refuse to be erased. Stay and watch how forgetting was rehearsed on purpose, and how paper stubbornly refused to cooperate. This is the final warning. The story was never lost. It was buried. Before we continue, a brief note for viewers: we will not show graphic images, only documents, maps, and responsibly curated photographs. If this history is new to you, pause and tell us where you're watching from and what you were taught about Tulsa in school. Add it in the comments so others can follow the trail. If you value evidence-based storytelling, subscribe and share this episode with someone who thinks the past is settled. Keep the discussion respectful. Cite sources when you can. Now, let's open the album that survived the fire. Before the fire, Greenwood felt ordinary in the most radical way. Barbers brushed jackets smooth. A pharmacist counted out prescriptions. A marquee flickered to life above neat rows of seats. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, porters, money moving through a black economy that worked. Sunday suits, hymnals, savings books, mortgages, prosperity arranged like storefront displays along Archer and Greenwood. Under Jim Crow, that quiet success read as provocation. The very sight of black modern life piano lessons, clean ledgers, a hospital's shining instruments threatened the script written to prevent it. On the surface, it was a small paradise, shops humming and children racing between porches. Beneath the varnish lay powder and fuses. Rumor machines warmed up deputized resentment, waiting on a signal, insurance clauses poised on a single word. Hold the contrast: a neighborhood at work, unworried in the daylight. And just under the floorboards, the match already struck. The seeds were planted long before the first window broke. After Reconstruction's promises were chiseled down by violence and court rulings, a new lattice of control replaced the old chains with statutes, poll taxes, literacy tests, ordinances about where a man could stand or sit or speak. Jim Crow did not need to shout to be heard. It wrote itself into train cars, jury boxes, school budgets, and the jobs a black veteran could expect after returning from France. Convict leasing kept the economy supplied with coerced labor under the color of law, while sheriffs learned the arithmetic of fines and arrests that made poverty pay. Newspapers trained the eye to look in one direction. Crime columns loaded with stereotypes, front pages that could boil a rumor into a summons. By 1919, the nation had already rehearsed the script in city after city. During a red summer of pogroms, the cast and cues were tragically portable. Greenwood, despite its success, existed inside those parentheses. In Tulsa, the architecture of suspicion rested on seemingly ordinary timbers: a courthouse, a daily paper, a telephone switchboard, where certain calls moved faster than others. One floor of an office building held an elevator whose doors would open on the wrong morning. A scream, startled ambiguous, was enough to activate the machine. By afternoon, the message hardened into type. Headline cadence does a special kind of work. It compresses doubt into assertion and spreads it for a penny a copy. When the accusation moved from whisper to column, it wasn't simply information. It was a green light for those already waiting on the curb with grievances they could not explain without revealing themselves. At dusk, the courthouse steps held a crowd whose presence was explanation enough. A boy was in a cell upstairs. A tradition older than the building demanded the crowd take him. Black veterans arrived because the law left to itself tends to side with momentum. They knew this from France and from home. Their uniforms may have been folded away, but their discipline remained visible in the way they kept to the curb, the way they spoke to deputies staring back through the doorway. The first sound that broke the standoff, someone's shot, no one's responsibility, traveled faster than reason. The return echo carried deputations and armbands with it. When the state announces that order must be restored, it rarely admits that it has already chosen whose order counts. The next hours exposed how institutions can be present and absent at the same time. Patrolmen appeared where they were not needed and disappeared where they were. Telephones worked beautifully when a posse needed consolidating and seemed to tangle when a pastor called for help. In some places, the law disarmed citizens who were defending their own streets. In others, the same law nodded at men headed in the same direction with rifles unexamined. Insurance lives in the space between words and fire. A clause like riot waits patiently in a drawer for the day it is needed. It does not waste energy arguing while the walls burn. It speaks later coolly in letters that end with, therefore. City codes, too, can hover like smoke barely seen until the morning they thicken into an ordinance that makes rebuilding a delay instead of a plan. None of this was an accident. Greenwood's prosperity multiplied the paranoia around it. Savings accounts and shop inventories read as a rebuke to those who believed the racial order was natural law. The very presence of black modernity-tailored clothes ledgers balanced to the penny a hospital, with instruments that gleamed, made the lie visible. Systems that depend on a hierarchy cannot abide successful counterexamples. They seek either to absorb or to erase them. Absorption was not on offer. On the sidewalks, elders had long been practicing a quieter kind of intelligence. They knew the gossip pathways. They kept an ear for names in headlines and watched for the tone of a city's voice when it turned toward them. Preachers translated that vigilance into catechism. Keep your papers, know your neighbors, learn the names of lawmen and their captains, right before you need to remember. On porches, church mothers told stories that sounded like folklore until you needed them, stories about how to move children when the street grows loud, where to place a trunk so the heavy end faces the door, who to send for when a house must empty in 4 minutes without panic. Survival culture passes for superstition until it pays dividends in minutes saved. In the months before the flames, something like a pressure change could be felt. The town's rumor machine ran warmer. Strange cars idled a second longer than usual at the edge of Greenwood. Strangers asked questions that did not match their clothes. A shopkeeper heard a joke told twice in the same words at 2 different counters, a sign of scripting, not coincidence. On Saturday nights, a few dogs bayed at nothing, then at something. No one could decide which explanation was worse. At the church, a deacon who read almanacs noticed how the wind had shifted that week, like a door left open on the wrong side of the house. There were signs in the literal sky. Engines overhead had become familiar enough, the new century's habit of looking up, but the timbre of a biplane's motor carries a special kind of authority. When a crowd is already knit tight, some would later say they saw rifles flash from above, others that they saw jars drop and burst into sprinkled flame. Still others that the planes marked targets only with their shadow. What matters in the moment is how people on the ground interpret the shape passing over them. If you feel watched from the air, you move differently on the street. If you believe fire can fall, you hug the walls. A symbol can be operational even when an investigation remains undecided. Down below, the cautionary rituals multiplied with the dusk. Cabinets were rearranged so documents could be gathered quickly. Wedding pictures were taken down so glass would not cut children if it fell. A teacher wrapped her attendance book in oilcloth and tied it with twine, then slid it into a flour sack because a bag of food is rarely searched before a family is counted and sent across town. A barber pocketed the day's cash differently. Some in the register, some beneath a floorboard he had pried up weeks before, and a few bills in an envelope addressed to a cousin who lived beyond the tracks. A pharmacist filled orders for bandages ahead of schedule and told himself it was only prudence. At the edge of the district, men practiced the choreography of what they could not quite name. They agreed on places to meet hand signals that would look like ordinary gestures to anyone not in the conversation. Veterans checked actions and bolts by feel careful not to present a tableau that could be used as evidence against them. Women organized the work that is always mislabeled, lists of who needed help, where infants slept, which widows had no family in town. Children learned a game that was not a game, how to cross a room low, how to follow a wall with your fingers when the lights go, how to carry a bundle that matters as if it does not. Warnings came that felt like folklore because they arrived as proverbs. Keep shoes near the bed. Water waits where the pump is, not where the bucket wishes. A key is a sentence it fits one door. In the cadence of church announcements, a pastor began a sentence about the coming Sunday and ended with a sentence about making a copy of your deed. There was nothing occult about it. There was a spiritual seriousness that treats preparation as a form of prayer. For those who wanted a sign in the dramatic sense, one arrived anyway. The sound of a crowd gathering at the county building and the peculiar silence that follows it, as though a city has taken a breath and intends to hold it. The language of the street shifted. Men who used to nod began to measure one another. Jokes became shorter, less musical, with long gaps after the punchline in which the sky seemed to listen. A white grocer across the avenue, usually genial, counted change without looking up. On a stoop, two teenagers rehearsed bravado and failed. Their bravado did not fit their shoulders. You could feel the scale tilting 1 ounce at a time. And then the ounce that tips the pan, a man with an armband directing others with a gesture practiced in a mirror, a formation that looked too tidy to be spontaneous. A glint of metal that belongs to authority, even when it is worn by someone who found it in a drawer. When the first window finally broke, it sounded like an answer to a question asked years earlier. The question was whether Greenwood's existence could be tolerated. The answer arrived not only through fists and torches, but through files and clauses already waiting for ink. The emergency was kinetic. The aftermath would be administrative. That is the cruelty of the design. Violence shouts and draws the eye, but erasure sits at desks the next morning and writes. Knowing this is not the same as preventing it. But naming it, seeing the system as a system, is how a community preserves the clarity that will be needed when the ledger opens, when the album is set on a table, when the city insists on a word that does not match the photographs. On the last evening before fire turned the district to a diagram of chimneys, a choir practiced a hymn in a church with excellent acoustics. The altos held their line clean. The tenors found the high note without strain. Across the street, a shopkeeper turned his sign from open to closed, then changed his mind and flipped it back because there were still people on the sidewalk who might need milk or thread. Far off, the steady cough of an engine circled once, twice the way a hawk measures a field. Somewhere a mother blew out a lamp and rested her hand on a child's shoulder until the child's breathing matched her own. The neighborhood exhaled. The powder waited. The fuse, though no one could see, it had already taken the flame. They called it a riot while the smoke was still climbing, as if a word chosen quickly could keep the facts from settling into place. The courthouse steps had emptied into streets braided with armed men, and Greenwood's careful geometry, porches, alleys, numbered doors, suddenly read like a map for an operation that had been waiting for a pretext. Deputies' badges appeared on lapels that had not worn them yesterday. Trucks idled at corners as if assigned. A line of men advanced down Archer with the rhythm of people who had practiced something together, if not this, then something like it. The city said order. The neighborhood heard a command to surrender its right to exist. The first arrests were framed as rescues, the way a storm fence rescues a field from wind, by catching what the wind tears loose. Men were told to put their hands up and walk where exactly was not explained, past their own front rooms, past the photographs that would be turned face down by strangers within the hour. If a soldier's discipline kept his eyes forward, a father's instinct kept glancing sideways toward a window, measuring the distance to a cradle, the minutes until someone might break the glass and call it evidence of resistance. A few officers tried to speak in the native language of reassurance, that slow downward tone that says compliance produces safety. But the grammar of their movements contradicted the script. Shutters splintered. A door frame gave way at a touch that was not gentle. Somewhere behind the line, a match flared. On the rail berm, a group of men argued in the abrupt style of people who know how quickly time can turn into trouble. Some had uniforms from another life folded in trunks at home. Now they wore work shirts and the look of people about to be told their citizenship was a misunderstanding. A shot cracked down the street, one then several in a scatter pattern that felt less like combat than like momentum breaking its leash. Reports split as they always do at the hinge of chaos. But the effect did not split. Windows let go. A marquee lost its consonants in a fall that looked almost graceful. What had been a district became a diagram of vulnerabilities, corners from which to fire roofs, to climb storefronts whose plate glass made a sound like ice shelves calving into a winter river. Law moved with the crowd rather than against it. The difference showed in small ways that added up which pockets were searched and which were not, where a cautioning hand touched a shoulder and where it did not, which houses were checked for contraband and which houses were considered secure. A church deacon, holding a Bible that might as well have been a ledger for all that mattered that morning, asked an officer how long the detention would last. The answer was a shrug, dressed as policy, long enough. Until we can sort you out. Words that postpone themselves so they never have to arrive. By dawn, the choreography took on the clarity of daylight. Men were marched in files past businesses. They had built the drugstore that once kept late hours for mothers with fevers in their children's cheeks, the tailor who had measured the city for its Sunday best. Along the route, ash sifted from empty windows like tired confetti. At the convention hall doors, the line thickened and pooled. Inside, a scribe at a table slid index cards toward the detained name-address employer, then tore a corner off each card and kept the stub. The stub meant you belonged to a system now. A sponsor's signature would be needed to exit. The word sponsor dressed itself as community, but wore the face of gatekeeping. Above, rafters held heat from the night before like an accusation that could not be spoken aloud. Elsewhere, the guard planted itself at intersections, bayonets lowered to the posture of neutrality that looks like threat from certain angles. In white neighborhoods, men were told to go home. In Greenwood, home was the first address made illegal. A teacher who had wrapped her attendance book in oilcloth the previous evening now understood why the ritual had felt like prayer. She held the packet close as she stepped forward, and when a man at the table asked what she carried, she told the truth names. He waved her along, uninterested in names, unless the names were attached to deeds and policies. That would come later after the smoke. What remained outside moved with less ceremony. Houses were emptied, not always crudely. Some people steal neatly as if tidiness were a virtue that wipes off fingerprints. A safe was levered from a pharmacy back room and dropped to the floor, the sound a dull official verdict. A Victorian mirror, heavy as certainty, met the ground in a burst of glitter that looked like an expensive snowfall. In a parlor, a violin case lay open. The instrument had been taken or spared. No one could tell, but the bow remained a fragile line across velvet, like the horizon of a different country. Looting speaks in images more than in words, and the images arrange themselves in an album without anyone needing to intend it. That is how the band Testimony began, quietly, almost bureaucratically. Cameras were plentiful. Plates and film stock did not require moral clarity to function. After the arrests, after the fires found edges and burned them to curves, people with lenses walked the ruins the way tourists pace a battlefield decades later. Only this battlefield was still hot. They framed chimneys against the sky and the geometric pride of brickwork that had refused to collapse. They posed in front of the wreckage as if proof of having been there were an achievement in itself. They wrote captions with a neat hand that remembered cursive drills from school ruins of Negro district searching for bodies taken from a plane. The language of the captions made claims about agency and perspective without admitting they were claims at all. Some of these prints became postcards 2-cent backs, with room for an address and a sentence in which a strange casualness did its bleak work. A few were sold, others were tucked into envelopes. Still others were pasted into albums, with black paper leaves the corners cut to take the photograph's edges so no adhesive would stain the image. The album was the opposite of the official record. Where the city's language narrowed and rationalized, this improvised archive broadened and refused to resolve. The album did not deliver a single thesis. It delivered a texture of absence and debris that no euphemism could smooth. It also delivered in its silence an indictment if the pictures could be taken and circulated. How could the event they recorded be so easily minimized? Meanwhile, voices that might have complicated the official story learned what it meant to be unrecorded. A nurse with hands that had spent the night changing dressings tried to file a statement and was told to return when someone with authority was present to take it. Authority had errands elsewhere. A porter who had watched a line of men pull furniture from a storefront and stack it with surprising care on the curb. Like movers hired by arson, found himself interrupted mid-sentence by a clerk who needed to lock the file room. A boy who would grow into an old man remembered airplanes. When he said so years later, a historian asked for tail numbers and pilot logs. Artifacts the boy had never seen up close, let alone cataloged. Memory met an evidentiary standard it could not satisfy. A failure of paperwork became a doubt in the record, then a talking point in the same circles that used the word riot with such efficiency. Even so, testimony found cracks to enter. In church bulletins, prayer lists grew long and strangely specific. Mrs. C., whose husband was held at the Fairgrounds. Mr. J., whose pharmacy safe was destroyed. The Johnson children who needed shoes. Letters traveled to cousins in Chicago and St. Louis. Sentences cautious but unmistakable in their architecture. We are safe, but the house is not. The school is standing, but not ours. There were planes, I think. Family Bibles took on new work births and deaths as always, but also addresses and dates of removal, scribbled in margins as if preparing for a future argument. The texture of this testimony is not courtroom polished. It is domestic and administrative, a counter-bureaucracy built at kitchen tables. If there was an authority that tried to take account of everything, it was the agency that arrives after most disasters, without asking permission, the nurses with cots, the men who set up soup lines, the people who count because someone has to. They noted numbers the way field surgeons note pulses, quickly, consistently knowing that the act of counting is itself a wager against erasure. How many houses burnt? How many families displaced? How many blocks no longer map to anything but air? Their ledgers would become a spine for later histories because arithmetic performed by the merciful carries an honesty that arithmetic performed by the culpable rarely tolerates. Still, even their pages left space where names should have been. Space is another form of loss. Outside the detention halls, the city resumed the posture of a place embarrassed by its own reflection. Editorials adopted tones of regret that point outward rather than inward, a sad necessity, an unfortunate extremity, a lesson in vigilance. The lesson was never about the mob. It was about the need to license restraint. Committees formed with dignified titles and mandates to study and to recommend. A grand jury convened as grand juries do, summoned by the promise that justice can be administrated like a ledger balanced before lunch. The findings wrote themselves in the passive voice. Responsibility became a shadow present, but ungraspable. And still the photographs multiplied. A second album began in another kitchen, its pages stiffer, its corners clipped more neatly. A clerk at a law office acquired a handful of prints from a cousin who knew a patrolman who had found them on the floor of a vacated room. A headline from the morning after was carefully cut and mounted beside an image of the street it claims to describe the juxtaposition doing the work of cross-examination that the city would not perform. Anyone who opened the album could see the mismatch, the headline's word and the camera's sentence refusing to agree. The album never raised its voice. It did not need to. All the while, Greenwood's people learned how to inhabit a city that had redefined them overnight. The index card stubs, proof of detention, ended up in drawers next to insurance letters that taught a harder lesson. A contract can be conditional in ways no one mentions until the moment you depend on it. The clause waited. It always had. Riot, the phrase said, and the rest of the sentence wrote itself into denial. You could mount the photographs beside these letters and call the display a syllabus in municipal power. You could point to the gap between what an image shows and what a policy can make disappear. The distance is measurable. It is also the work of decades to cross. The greenest shoots began before the ash cooled. A carpenter set a new sill where the old one had charred. A pastor set folding chairs in a rectangle and called it a sanctuary. A midwife moved her bag to an aunt's front room and turned it into a clinic. Rebuilding is an argument the simplest, most stubborn kind that refuses to wait for permissions that will never be offered freely. Each hammer blow, each ledger reopened with fewer lines than before. Each primer laid out on a desk, salvaged from a school's basement, insists on a definition of citizenship not written by a court. The photographs will catch this too in time. Faces not triumphant exactly, but set in a narrow, durable light that knows how to outlast a season. Where words failed, an ethic of memory took over. People told the story without flourishes and without euphemism. A habit that looks unadorned until you notice how rare it is. They taught younger listeners how to hold two truths at once, that the city could organize a parade for itself while refusing to admit the names of those it had made homeless. That the album could be macabre and still be a tool for instruction. That grief, if disciplined, can become a kind of governance, rules for what must never be allowed to pass for sense again. If the truth felt banned, it was not because the law had stamped the word on a file. It was because the culture had agreed to avert its gaze. The testimony that survived did so by breaking that agreement. In the years to come, the debate would professionalize. Archivists cataloged the postcards. Scholars argued about planes. Planners traced the path from ash to urban renewal and the radius of policies that finished what the flames began. But standing in the room with the album, turning the pages that a hand once glued, reading captions that pretend to be casual while telling you more than they know, you feel the intimacy of evidence. It was not meant to be noble. It was meant to be ordinary. That is precisely why it will not let the ordinary lie about itself anymore. By mid-morning, the geography of Greenwood had been rewritten into a grammar of ruins, subject-verb-object, reduced to chimney street sky. What stood only hours earlier as a pharmacy where a mother once found fever powder now existed as a rectangle of ash rimmed by bricks that held their shape out of habit. The Red Cross would count quietly and with the cool diligence of people who repair what they can. How many blocks erased? How many homes unroofed? How many families without any place to sleep but a church floor? Arithmetic became a lifeline thrown across a river of denial. In the photographs that survived, the ones pasted later into the Macabre album, you can almost hear the hush that follows a loud event when the city is out of breath and the birds have not yet decided whether to return. There are men in hats, standing with their hands on their hips, because this too is a posture of ownership. There are women in coats despite the heat, because dignity is a temperature you set from the inside. The camera records without comment. That indifference is strange mercy. It leaves space for the truth to enter. The evidence did not limit itself to images. Ledger lines testified in their own thin voices. Inventory stopped midweek accounts receivable that would never be received, prescriptions logged for patients whose addresses no longer mapped to streets. A hospital's order book listed instruments that gleamed in gaslight the night before. The next day, someone wrote a note unusable. In the Fairgrounds, a scribe filled index cards with the same 3 questions again and again: name, address, employer, and tore stubs with the mechanical pressure of someone determined not to think too much about the hands he was counting. In church basements, nurses wrote tallies beside their own exhausted names. The balances did not add up, and that failure announced itself as loudly as any headline. You cannot reconcile what has been made deliberately irreconcilable. In the album's middle pages, the stills turn forensic. Frame by frame, the camera makes a map of absence. Here is a street where the clergy met last month to discuss a relief fund for a different family's house fire. Now every house is an address looking for a building. Here is the iron rib of a bedstead, the kind that creaks with memory fused to the floor like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one meant to write. Here is a schoolroom stripped to its outlines, blackboard faintly gray with the ghost of arithmetic problems that had promised children a future built from numbers. Whoever took these pictures favored clean angles, as if geometry could extract order from calamity. That preference, too, is a kind of confession. The photographer could only bear the scene by pretending it could be diagrammed. Where the official record stayed circumspect, the album edged close to the unsayable without exploiting it. The captions were small, a handwriting learned in copybooks that prized uniform loops. Ruins looking east, one says, as if direction could help the viewer not get lost. Searching for the missing, says another beside a trench whose meaning the image refuses to confirm. The restraint is deliberate. No gore, no spectacle. The macabre here is architectural absence, arranged ash behaving like a surface household things made into relics by heat and time. This restraint matters because it denies those who would dismiss the archive as sensational, when a picture shows only a block of chimneys and a horizon, and still the heart knows exactly what it's looking at. The problem is not style. It is conscience. Inside the detention halls, paperwork continued like weather index cards, lists, signatures. Between benches, men traded rumors about mass graves and legal remedies in the same breath, because when a city has taught you what it values, it is natural to imagine both a hole in the earth and a loophole in a policy. A pastor made a circuit with a notebook collecting names to be matched with families later. A sergeant from the guard who believed himself decent adjusted his posture to look less like a wall and more like a door. That posture was still a wall. The logic of the place required it. Detention did not end chaos. It converted it into a form the city could file. Outside, scouts for power companies walked slowly, their eyes on poles and lines. Utilities define what returns first after catastrophe. And that is a philosophy as much as a practice. If a grid hums, commerce whispers that it might hum again. In Greenwood, the hum would take time. The city could restore current where it wished, and delay where it felt delay would teach the proper lesson. Even light is political when someone else owns the switch. Toward afternoon, the guards' lines relaxed from taut to merely watchful. Order re-entered conversation like a guest with bad timing. Officials toured with the performance of concern, discussing fire breaks and the potential for contagion, as if the fever to be avoided now were not moral, but literal. Some men found themselves disarmed twice, first by law, then by the architecture of the convention hall, whose high ceilings turned every footstep into an announcement that echoed the power of the building more than the intent of the walker. A clerk who had not slept much produced a stack of forms with the same muscle memory he used last month to permit parades. The ability to repurpose bureaucracy is one of a city's most frightening talents. Even in that atmosphere, records that refused erasure accumulated. A dentist salvaged his appointment book. The pages smelled of smoke, but when opened, still offered a neat calendar of obligation names, times a notation for a boy's first filling that would now not be done. A grocer found his order ledger in the alley. The cover board had charred to a coin bronze color, and the cloth binding peeled like old paint, but inside the columns held steady. Evidence, even petty evidence, endures in ways fire does not anticipate. The album absorbed these small survivals, photographed them sometimes awkwardly, because the photographer understood that a grocery ledger can be more damning than a speech. When the counting of houses turned into the counting of claims, the second part of the revelation began. Denial arrived in envelopes thin and polite, as a refusal at a dinner table. A clause did the killing work, the event was a riot, therefore the policy does not apply. Therefore your loss is real, but not compensable. Therefore the signatures of our representatives last summer, when we happily took your premium, do not bind us today. The word therefore is the most dangerous tool in a bureaucrat's kit capable of lifting harm out of context and setting it down somewhere reason cannot reach. The album does not capture the tone of those letters, but the juxtaposition is available to any reader with a table set a picture of a chimney beside a denial stamped with the word exclusion, and watch the room grow cold. There were other mechanisms for erasure more subtle than a clause and more durable than a match. In the courthouse, a grand jury composed its report with the practiced hand of people who know what will be expected of them. Passive voice softened edges. The sequence of events rearranged itself just enough to make the defender look like an aggressor and the aggressor like a fact of nature. The finding did not brazenly contradict the album. It ignored it. Ignoring is a solvent. It does not stain the fingers. In the newspaper office, editors composed retrospectives that sounded generous lessons learned, vigilance required, and rearranged grief into a moral directed at the wrong audience. Blame dressed as advice. All of this answers a question that runs beneath the images, like a current, why the record had to become a privately kept album in the first place. Because public record keepers were implicated or indifferent. Because institutions treat memory as a warehouse, they can organize, and certain crates are easier to misplace than to open. Because when a neighborhood stands as a counterexample to a hierarchy, the hierarchy's most efficient move is to make the counterexample look like a cautionary tale instead. Prosperity misnamed as provocation, self-defense relabeled as conspiracy, relief described as pacification. The album counters these translations by offering nouns without adjectives: street, chimney, ledger, pew, safe. A viewer supplies the adjectives, and in that act of supply discovers where conscience lives. The climax is not a single scene. It is a recognition that arrives in stages. First, the eye understands that 35 blocks of a city can vanish in a day. Then the mind accepts that the vanishing can be excused by those responsible with a vocabulary built precisely for such excusing. Finally, the will admits that repair requires more than acknowledgement. It requires a refusal to let language close the case. When survivors later argued for what had happened from pulpits and porches, they were doing archival work describing not only flames and gunfire, but the texture of policy that made recovery a maze. Their clarity turns the album's pages into a curriculum. Learn how denial phrases itself, learn how claims are shaped to fail. Learn how ordinances can stall a hammer. The photographs that linger longest do not display the largest damage. They find the small hinge on which a life swings. A single intact teacup on a windowsill of dust. A stack of hymnals warped by heat but still readable if you are patient. A child's slate, its chalk marks smudged to a gray paddle that still implies a lesson. The macabre lives here not in gruesome detail, but in the stubborn presence of the everyday, framed by deliberate absence. When the city later insists on words like disturbance or unrest, these images refuse to comply. Unrest does not unshelve teacups with surgical care. Disturbance does not break a safe and leave a ledger open to the page where last month's tithe is recorded. Only intent does that. Only policy says afterward that intent is not the point. An aerial photograph, grainy later taken by someone with a sense of documentation, shows the district as a patchwork of negatives, where structures used to cast their positive shadows. If you trace a finger across the contact print, you can guess where alleys once carried gossip, where a barber would have lifted his eyes to the window for a minute's rest between customers, where a teacher hurried with a roll book under her arm. From altitude, the pattern looks almost abstract, like an experiment in urban form. That is the last danger, that distance becomes detachment. The album answers again by returning us to the ground, to the scale of a door frame, to the stubborn weight of a family Bible carried out of a house at just the right minute. When night returned, it did not bring the same darkness. Light pools in ruins differently. It finds edges where none used to be and invents shadows to match. Survivors slept under roofs not meant for them, or under roofs not meant for any sleeping at all. Sentries dozed in chairs, rifles resting the way. A tired man rests a tool he cannot put down. Somewhere, a clerk unscrewed the cap on a bottle and filmed the nib of a pen to carry one more denial across a page. Somewhere else, a woman tore a strip of fabric to bind a cut and said a prayer whose words were so practiced they sounded like breathing. The revelation, then, is layered. It shows the extent of the physical destruction without violating the dignity of those who endured it. It exposes the second wave paperwork that completes what fire begins without raising its voice, because there is power in speaking low when the facts are heavy. It explains why a neighborhood so carefully built was so quickly unbuilt, and why those with the tools to save the record chose instead to curate forgetting. And it insists with every page that the images we inherit are not ornaments for retrospectives, but instruments for repair. The album's blank spaces are as instructive as its photographs. They imply what cannot show itself and ask the present to supply what the past could not keep safe. Morning would come again, as mornings do, and with it the decisions that decide a century. Which lots to condemn, which codes to enforce, which street names to keep or repaint, which photographs to file under which drawer. Those seemingly small choices are the gears of erasure, and they mesh because no one admits they are teeth. By placing pictures and ledgers and index cards side by side, the Macabre album makes the machinery visible. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. That is the climax's truest work, to turn spectators into witnesses, and witnesses into people who understand that the story has never asked for awe, only for accuracy, and for the resolve to do with accuracy what the city refused to do with power. The morning after is never just a morning. It is policy wearing daylight. Streets that once moved people to work now escorted them to offices where forms were handed across counters with the practiced gentleness of ordinary harm. The city spoke in future tense about rebuilding, while the present tense sat on church steps waiting to be called by name. Children learned alternative routes to places that no longer existed. Mothers learned the geography of relief stations and which lines moved faster because a clerk recognized a face. The ledger of loss lengthened without spectacle wages, missed interest, not earned instruments, not replaced apprenticeships, interrupted a shop's supplier switching allegiance because distance had made loyalty expensive. The body can heal from smoke. Balance sheets inhale it more slowly and do not always recover. What lingered was not only ash, but the architecture of an answer. When survivors told their stories, they built a counter-city on paper maps annotated with the names of barbers and dressmakers, schedules of services held in borrowed rooms, lists of the detained matched to the sponsors who signed them out with the same hands that had declined to sign checks the week before. The effect was cumulative and precise, a bureaucracy of care to resist a bureaucracy of erasure. In basements and back pews, committees formed not to argue abstractions, but to match a widow to a roof, a fever to a bottle of quinine, a notebook of deeds to a lawyer willing to risk the kind of reputation the courthouse punished. Memory took up residence not only in witness, but in place. An empty lot is never empty when the person pointing to it can supply the missing nouns. That corner was the pharmacy with the clock that ran 5 minutes fast, a kindness to mothers. That doorway was the tailor who knew the slope of every shoulder on the block. That bit of curb held the bench where the boys too old to be called boys worked out their posture and their politics. When a city tells you that a neighborhood was a problem, you answer by listing the ways it solved problems: a church soup pot that appeared before anyone asked a schoolroom that bent Saturday into a study hall, a funeral that collected enough envelopes to carry a family through a season. These are not sentimental details. They are the infrastructure of citizenship. Greenwood had it. The album proves it by absence. Some truths grew louder with distance. The photographs that once circulated as tawdry souvenirs hardened into exhibits and syllabi. Archivists learned the names behind captions and the addresses behind chimneys. Photocopies made their own diaspora into classrooms, court filings, newsrooms, where editors hesitated over the word that had misled a century. Riot did tidy work in ink. Massacre does untidy work in conscience. In that shift of language, a city's shoulders lowered a fraction, acknowledging a weight long denied. People trained to weigh evidence against memory discovered that here memory had been the more rigorous discipline. It had recorded what institutions could not admit without unraveling their own stories about themselves. The present tense kept making demands. A rebuilt storefront had to negotiate with codes that had delayed it. A family who returned to a lot inherited not a house, but a choice between stubbornness and migration. Even after the last cinder went dull, investment moved unevenly, like a weather map where the rain avoids a county for reasons the forecast never explains. Urban renewal would arrive later with the confidence of modern efficiency and cut through what survived with a ruler's certainty. The photographs could not prevent that, but they could sit on council tables and ask whether the second loss had learned anything from the first. Sometimes the answer was yes. More often, it was a long pause, followed by a plan revised only at the margins. Education became the stubborn art of saying the obvious, until it sounded like revelation that prosperity under segregation was not a paradox, but a proof of genius, that the language of order has often hidden the mechanics of theft. That paper kept faithfully by people with little time to spare can outlast a city's pride. School lessons that once skipped from Reconstruction to World War II learned to stop in Tulsa and to speak the date without flinching. Students practiced reading images the way previous generations practiced penmanship, careful attention to corners and shadows to what is inside the frame and what must exist just beyond it. A child who understands why a caption matters is a citizen unlikely to confuse paperwork with justice. The album's afterlife gathered collaborators. Librarians who fought humidity with humming boxes and cotton gloves. Volunteers who learned the grammar of metadata so a searcher 2 states away could find a grandmother's block. Pastors who lent fellowship halls for community scans. Bring your shoeboxes. We will copy your pictures and you will keep them. Historians who learned to begin a paragraph with the words according to and end it with a footnote that honored the kitchen table where the story had been perfected. The labor looked small from a distance. Up close, it was a scaffolding on which a city could practice telling the truth without falling. Law entered again slower and more deliberate than the first time. Petitions for recognition suits asking not only for damages, but for the public admission that opens the door to policy. Commissions convened to count not only the losses, but the mechanisms, so future sentences would read correctly, insurance denied because of a clause, detention enacted under orders, ordinances drafted with the effect, if not the explicit intent of delay. The right words matter because they change what an affidavit can claim and what a budget can fund. When institutions finally spoke in that grammar, even cautiously, survivors recognized a dialect they had been using for decades. The private work continued alongside the public. Families rebuilt their archives with the same resolve they brought to roofs and porches. A granddaughter learned to mount brittle prints on acid-free paper. A grandson interviewed an elder with questions that had learned to be both gentle and precise. A ledger turned into a family tree when someone realized the list of customers was also a census of a neighborhood now carried in the blood. Memory revealed its other power not only to accuse but to assemble. Reunion dinners became quiet seminars on municipal power. Church anniversaries became juries that reached no verdict but refused to close deliberations. There were at intervals gestures that felt like repair rather than ceremony. A scholarship fund named for a nurse whose hands had been steady for 2 nights running. A business incubator that took its name from a street erased on older maps. A museum that organized its rooms not around disaster, but around craft carpenters' squares, seamstresses' chalk dentists' tools that gleamed because hands had kept them bright. When visitors left those rooms, the album's images looked different, the ruins no longer read as the end of a story, but as a parenthesis around a sentence strong enough to survive the interruption. None of this erased the fact that restitution, when it came, was partial by definition. A check can no more carry a century than a caption can. But precision in policy housing, where families used to stand grants, where enterprises used to hum attention, paid to the lots where soil remembers heat, made the abstract visible. Where officials had once balanced concerns, they now balanced budgets with line items that spoke in Greenwood's verbs, rebuild, preserve, teach. A city that had once deputized forgetting could on better days deputize memory and pay it a wage. The album never asked to be a sacred object. It asked to be believed. Its power lies not in the macabre, but in restraint, no gore, no performative grief. Only the quiet insistence that a street with chimneys and no walls is a verdict no euphemism can vacate. When people stand before those pages, they tend to fall quiet in the way a courtroom does when a witness sits. Silence is not emptiness. It is attention arranging itself. In that silence, questions arrive that do not fit neatly in exhibits. Who kept taking these pictures when it was not safe? Who bought them and why? Who hid them and for whose sake? Each answer is a small hinge swinging open onto a larger room. The warning embedded in the album is not only about 1921. It is about the civic habit of misnaming harm and the temptation to treat paperwork as a sacrament that absolves those who draft it. The counter habit is boring by design. Keep minutes, keep receipts, keep scanning, keep teaching. Keep asking the same question at public meetings until the answer grows specific. The work looks humble until you track its arc across a generation and realize that somewhere along the line, a child in a classroom stopped hearing riot and started hearing massacre, stopped hearing unrest, and started hearing policy stopped. Thinking of photographs as decor and started recognizing them as affidavits with emulsion. If there is a final image to hold, let it be of a table. On it, 3 objects, a photograph of chimneys, a ledger that still smells of smoke, and a letter stamped denial in purple ink. Around the table, people from different years, someone who remembers the heat, someone who learned the story from a grandmother's hand, someone who found a postcard in a flea market and knew enough to bring it home. They do not agree on everything. They agree on the order in which to place the objects. First, the picture, what happened. Then the ledger, who lived here. Then the letter, what was done afterward. The sequence makes the argument plain without raising its voice. This is where the story leaves us, not with closure but with capacity. A city cannot undo a match struck a century ago, but it can decide repeatedly whether its present tense will keep rehearsing erasure or practice repair. The album that survived the fire does not forgive, and it does not condemn. It instructs. We are the ones who decide whether instruction becomes law, whether law becomes habit, whether habit becomes the kind of memory that protects. The question that remains is simple and demanding. The kind of photograph asks, without words. Now that you have seen what evidence looks like when it refuses to die, what will you do with it today at your own table under the lights you control?